Welcome back to the podcast Unbinding the Bible. This is episode 132, The God's Domain. And in this episode, what I would like to do is look at just one narrative in the Old Testament to help explain a little more clearly some of the comments that I made in last week's episode. I do realize that I dropped quite a bit of new information, or maybe new to some of you, in that very one episode. But in this episode, what I would like to do is simply look at a story that may in fact actually be familiar to you. It is one that does show up in some children's Bibles, and you may have heard this story in Sunday school or come across it in your Bible reading. But there's a portion of this story that when we look at it a little closer, might actually appear a bit strange, at least to the way we normally think of the world. And based upon what I shared in last week's episode, I think I can bring to light a little more clarity to an otherwise somewhat confusing several verses at the end of this narrative. And so we're going to look at the healing of Naaman the Syrian, and I'll read for you several verses from 2 Kings 5, and then make a few observations about what this teaches us about the different domains that these gods are given responsibility over. So I'm excited for this and excited for you to learn with me. Let's just jump right in. To begin this week's episode, allow me just to remind you all of a short passage that I read on last week's episode from Deuteronomy 32, a reference to something that the Lord did at the Tower of Babel when he dispersed the nations to spread them across the face of the earth. He actually assigned many of these divine beings to rule over and to be responsible for dispensing the Lord's justice over these various nation states, these various geographical regions. And in Deuteronomy 32, Moses recounts for us that when the Most High, so that is the Lord himself, he is one among his divine council. There are other divine beings, but not in the same way that the Lord is divine. And I want to make sure we are clear on that. When the Old Testament refers to the Lord as the Most High, clearly the Lord is the creator. The Lord is the sustainer, and he is constantly rebuking his people for trusting in these other gods to produce what only he can. These other gods, as we'll get into in future episodes, were responsible for ordering justice and ordering the societies that lived within these nation states. And yet many of these fallen beings did a deplorable job, and the Lord not only will rebuke the people responsible for the injustice that is going on in the land, but also these rulers themselves. But in Deuteronomy 32, Moses says, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted heritage. And so once again, what we see is that for the Lord, he took his portion to be Israel. This was the geographical area. This was the people that the Lord decided to be responsible for properly dispensing justice. And of course, the Lord, being the Most High and being pure and holy and fully righteous, is able to deal with his own people in a very unique and special way. And so what we have a lot of times through the Old Testament are wars and fighting going on over space, over land, over geography. And you sometimes have Israel walking through other nations' territory or other nations' domains. And then you have other figures from nations walking into Israel's domain. And so it's important to keep in mind that wherever you happen to be, is a representation of the space over which the God you think is in charge of that space, over which he rules. And so this is a narrative. Like I said, many of you might know this story. It's 19 verses. Let me just read the whole thing. I'll make a few observations, but I'm really going to focus in toward the end of the narrative. But in verse 1 of 2 Kings 5, this is what we read. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and in high favor, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. Now the Syrians, on one of their raids, had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel, and she worked in the service of Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "Would that my Lord were with the prophet who was in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy." So Naaman went in and told his Lord, "Thus and so spoke the girl from the land of Israel." And the king of Syria said, "Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So he went, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, "When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent to you Naaman my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy." And when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God, to kill and to make alive, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he is seeking a quarrel with me." But when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent to the king, saying, "Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." But Naaman was angry and went away, saying, "Behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" So he turned and went away in a rage. But his servants came near and said to him, "My father, it is a great word that the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, 'Wash and be clean'?" So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Then he returned to the man of God, he and all his company, and he came and stood before him, and he said, "Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. So accept now a present from your servant." But he said, "As the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will receive none." And he urged him to take it, but he refused. Then Naaman said, "If not, please let there be given to your servant 2 mule loads of earth. For from now on your servant will not offer burnt offering or sacrifice to any god but the Lord. In this matter may the Lord pardon your servant. When my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, leaning on my arm, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, when I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter." He said to him, "Go in peace." Now, that's a fascinating story, and I remember in the Jesus Storybook Bible a beautiful rendition of Naaman being made clean. And part of the way that storybook Bible focuses in on Naaman's heart attitudes are primarily when he says, "Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I go and wash in those rivers and be clean?" And one of the ways that this story highlights for us is the idea that for Naaman, he believed that the rivers, these bodies of water that were present in his country, were clearly superior to this dirty, small, nasty Jordan that was present in Israel's place. In fact, what he was hoping to receive was just some magical wave of a wand, and that he would speak this beautiful utterance over Naaman, and he would be clean. And part of the narrative itself is this explanation of how it is that following the Lord might actually involve doing something humbling, doing something that does not draw wonderful attention to you. And yet when you place your faith truly in the Lord and are willing to go where he says and to do what he says, he will bring about the cleansing that we seek. But what I really want to focus in on for the purposes of this podcast episode is to what happens at the end. Naaman, out of just pure joy and pure excitement, offers the man of God, Elisha, he offers him a gift. And Elisha won't take it. He realizes, as I think it's important to remember, that what the Lord provides for people is always free. There is nothing that you and I can do to pay him back for anything that he's done for us. And I think Elisha embodies this perfectly. And Naaman realizes that he says, if you then won't take a gift from me, perhaps you will grant me a gift. And this interchange happens where in verse 17, Naaman simply says, if not, right, if you will not receive a gift from me, please let there be given to your servant 2 mule loads of earth. For from now on, your servant will not offer burnt offering or sacrifice to any god but the Lord. Now, here's where things get interesting, because what a weird request, right? Give me 2 wheelbarrow loads of dirt. Give me 2 mule loads of dirt. Like what in the world? Why does Naaman ask for dirt, especially in the middle of a conversation where he's washing in a river? He's incredibly clean. His skin is now clean and smooth like a little child. And boom, out of nowhere, you get this conversation about dirt. And you think, well, dirt, cleanliness, uncleanliness, what's happening here? It's not that as much as this idea that Naaman requesting loads of dirt has to do with the land itself. He knows that the land over which the Lord rules is special, clearly demonstrated by what's just happened to him. And he knows that the only proper way to worship the Lord is to worship him in his space, if you will, holy space, holy ground, right? And so in Naaman's mind, if he can simply take some of that space back with him to Syria, then he can properly worship the Lord there, even though another god has jurisdiction in Syrian space. This is what actually Naaman goes on to explain in the very next verse. In verse 18, he says, "In this matter, may the Lord pardon your servant. When my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, leaning on my arm, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, when I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter." What Naaman is saying is, I want to sacrifice to the Lord. I want to offer worship to the Lord. But the way to offer worship to the Lord when the Lord's space is Israel is for me to take a little bit of that Israel's space back with me, lay that dirt on the ground in Syria, and in this way I will be able to be connected to the Lord whose domain is in Israel because I have a little tiny plot of Israel in Syria. That's what's going on here. That's the belief system of the way things worked in the Old Testament. And this is what will go on later for Israel, is what made life in exile particularly devastating for the people. If they were carried off to another place, to the way the prophets call it, to a land not their own, then would their God still be able to take care of them there? And if another nation's God was able to come into Israel's territory and defeat them there, what did that say about Israel's God and the strength that he did or didn't possess over his own domain? Welcome to the world of the prophets from ancient Israel. In fact, much of the prophet's writing is directed toward helping Israel understand both that destruction was coming, yes, even within Israel's borders as a result of Israel's unfaithfulness, but that did not mean that the other nations' gods were stronger than the Lord. This has to be addressed constantly. In fact, from the lips of the messengers from Assyria, they boast and taunt Israel that what other nation has been able to stop their king from coming in and doing whatever he darn well pleased with the peoples of these other nations? None, and therefore the Lord wouldn't be able to do it either. And one of the big things that the prophets have to continually repeat and reaffirm to the people is not that their defeat was a sign of their God's impotence. Rather, their defeat was directly related to the fact that the Lord withdrew his hand of protection from Israel and allowed these other nations to overtake them. A consequence that the Lord repeatedly told the people would happen if they chose to reject what his hand of protection meant for them. You see, the Lord's willingness to be their God and for them to be his people was in fact dependent upon their willingness to follow the guidelines that he set out for them. But time and time and time again, Israel looked across the other side of the fence, saw the activities of the other nations and the way their gods had led them toward ways of justice or injustice or big military or nationalistic endeavors, and decided that that's what Israel wanted to be like. And in a sense, very, very truly sense, they rejected the Lord's rule over them and adopted the ways of the nations around them. In fact, some commentators suggest that this house of Rimmon that's repeated several times from Naaman in verse 18, when I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, when I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, when my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there and I'm there to help him stand up, please pardon me. Don't allow the Lord to look at that action and think that I've turned my back on him. I'm only there now as a servant to my master. But remember, I'm taking this dirt back with me so that I've got a special place that reminds me that the Lord is the one who is truly to be worshiped. And I will not offer burnt offering or sacrifice to any God but the Lord. So when you see me in this temple, don't be mistaken. Don't think I've now gone back on my word. I'm really only there to help stabilize my master. He's leaning on my arm. He needs me there. So when he sees that, don't let him think that I've turned my back on the Lord. Let him recognize that I'm just there to serve. And Elisha very clearly ends in verse 19 by saying to him, go in peace. You're good. I get it. I understand how this works. And so we see in the Old Testament, and there are other stories, but I'm just going to bring this one to you for this episode. We see that the domain of the gods is determined based upon the way that the Lord fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. And there are some commentators who think that the house of Rimmon, or the god of Rimmon in Syria, is just another reference to Baal, the god of the storm, who Israel was tempted to worship more than any other god. They always sought to recognize what it is that the worshipers of Baal thought their God was responsible for providing for them. And Israel wanted to have the same things provided for them, and so were therefore tempted to order and structure their society, their economy, around the same values that Baal had encouraged the Syrians to center their economy around. And so this is what happens when you deal with authority, or you deal with rule, or you deal with dominion. These are the kinds of phrases that Paul uses in the New Testament. Tim Gombas refers to this as cosmically contested space. And that is in Ephesians 1, for example, where Paul tells us that the Lord worked in Christ great power when he raised him from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly places, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, and above every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the one to come. You see, rule and authority and power and dominion, that's referring to domains. That's referring to spheres of rule, areas where authority has been granted. Well, this is back to Deuteronomy 32. The Lord fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. There are divine beings, these principalities, these rulers, those with authority, power, and dominion over various geographical jurisdictions. And that's exactly what Naaman recognizes, and that's exactly what Elisha understands that Naaman recognizes, and grants him the 2 mule loads of dirt that he requests so that he can take back to his own space a small portion of Israelite holy space, which to Naaman's mind is inseparably connected to the God of that space who just healed him from his leprosy. So when Naaman returns to Syria, to a place that is under the authority, rule, and dominion of another god, i.e. Baal or Rimmon, however you seek to define that, he will be able to lay out a plot of that dirt, that soil, that space in this other space, and that little small space will be a tiny sliver of a place where he can connect deeply with the Lord who actually rules that domain. Now, I hope that that's helpful for you. I promise you we are going to get to some more clarification about how this actually works out in your life and in mine, because I want to let you know that when you get into the New Testament, Paul does not drop this idea from many of his letters. In fact, cosmically contested space is a powerful way that Paul uses to explain spiritual reality. And we will get into this, particularly as it relates to the church being the temple of the living God. What we are dealing with in that word from 2 Corinthians 3, from 1 Corinthians 3, from 1 Corinthians 6, from Ephesians chapter 2, from 1 Peter chapter 2, when the church is referred to as the temple of the living God, what we are saying is the church now occupies this holy space. The church is now the place, right? This holy place, this soil, this geographical realm over which the Lord rules, or over which the Lord has the domain and the authority and the power. Now, how Paul will go on to describe the way in which the church can faithfully embody the Lord's power, strength, dominion, and rule will be very strongly opposed to the way these rulers in the heavenly places demonstrate their rule, authority, power, and dominion. The clearest example of this is the way that Rome embodied such rule and power and dominion. And if you have been following me on the podcast for any length of time, you might have tuned into several of the episodes in the book of Revelation. And in the book of Revelation, we get a very clear picture between the way the Lord embodies his rule and power and dominion and authority, i.e. via the Lamb, and the way that Caesar embodies rule and authority and power and dominion, i.e. via the beast. And this is not coincidental. This is exactly the cosmically contested space, the people of the heavens versus the people on the earth, that the New Testament is desperately attempting to communicate to us. And so while you and I might think, well, loads of dirt, we don't even use mules today. What does he want us to go get a big wheelbarrow and fill it up with dirt? Don't miss the point. The point is that a portion of the space that the Lord has jurisdiction over, if a portion of that space can come with you, it can accompany you back to a place and back to a space that used to be foreign to the Lord's rule. But because the Lord graciously gives you a portion of his own domain and his own controlled space, you are free to take that space with you wherever you go. That is a message that the New Testament is rife with, is that the Lord's space is embodied in his Son. And then once his Son has raised, he has chosen to embody and to transfer that holy space through his Spirit, which can in fact be taken by his people wherever they go. So don't lose sight of this idea, because in the Old Testament, this is deeply embedded here. And in fact, what Paul and the other writers of the New Testament will be very interested in communicating to us is how it is that we are called to live out under the Lord's domain in a world that has been hijacked by these principalities and powers. And we will look at that in future episodes. We will continue to dip into the Old Testament, but I'm very eager to eventually arrive in the New Testament and to attempt to connect some more of these dots for you. But that is all that I wanted to talk about today on this week's episode. Thank you so much for continuing to tune in, to reach out via email or Messenger or Instagram or other things like that. Be looking for new episodes. If you've got questions about these episodes, please feel free to email me at unbindingthebible@gmail.com. Thank you so much for those who continue to support the podcast and continue to just pursue Jesus on your own. I'm thankful for you, and I'm thankful for the encouragement that you provide to me, the great questions that many of you are asking and have asked me or asked others, to be able to understand better what it means to truly follow Jesus. It's exciting, and I'm excited to continue to explore this with you. Have a great week. Talk to you next time.